Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now in our third season, and we're just more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on cities, built environments, and infrastructure. And today we're going to talk about how infrastructure affects the health of the environment as well as our own health. Now, basically, infrastructure, which we've been hearing a lot about over the last year with this big infrastructure bill, and I think it stretched the imagination of many of us as to exactly what is infrastructure. But it's our physical foundation. Infrastructure is things like facilities and structures, and it's what our society needs to operate. And this includes things like roads, highways, buildings, bridges, energy, and internet. And cities all around the U.S. are currently dealing with outdated and aging infrastructure. As a country, we all experience and know we must now invest in infrastructure for a better future. And we must do that in a way that's environmentally responsible as well as equitable. Now, concrete, steel, and fiber optic cable are the essential building blocks of the economy and of our infrastructure. Infrastructure enables us to trade. It powers our businesses and enables our businesses to operate. It connects workers to their jobs, and it seeks to protect all of us from an increasingly unpredictable natural environment that we ourselves have had some cause in inducing through our own behaviors, that is, climate change. From private investment in telecommunications systems, broadband networks. We see that a lot as we see the advertisements with T-Mobile and Verizon. All of them are touting just how great their 5G is. We see that. And we also see the private investment in energy projects, freight railroads, pipelines, and then there's the big public spending on transportation, again, things such as roads, airports, bridges, as well as public spending like building, water, and parks. Infrastructure is the backbone of a thriving economy. Infrastructure is the backbone of our economy. That is, as we know it, what we see, what we live through and experience each and every day of our lives now. It also supports workers, providing millions of jobs each year in building infrastructure projects, as well as operating them and maintaining them. A recent Brookings Institution analysis showed that 14 million people have jobs in fields that are directly related to infrastructure. And this includes things like train and mass transit engineers and electrical power line workers, internet cable installers to truck drivers and airline pilots, and many more. Infrastructure jobs account for about 11% of our country's workforce today, and it's expected to grow exponentially over the next decade. And then unlike Western Europe and parts of Asia, our country still has a growing population. We've added about 25 million people in the past 10 years, and this tremendous growth has been concentrated in the 50 largest metropolitan areas or cities and will place many new demands on already overtaxed infrastructure, as well as the people who live there. But now, if you think that infrastructure and public health are not related, then you need to think again. Poor infrastructure has been linked with lead poisoning, accidents and injury, asthma, just to name a few. Infrastructure projects all inevitably will impact the health and the environment of our local communities. And there can be important health-related risk related to climate change consequences, exposure to dangerous environmental circumstances, as well as displacement from homes and jobs. Now, we all prefer to take our infrastructure for granted. It's much easier, and indeed we do, wake up every day and assume that our systems are in place and will continue to work as they always have, and that they'll magically work every time we need them. But when disruptions occur, like a road closure or a power outage or a water main break, or if your internet's down, on those occasions, then we are reminded of just how much we need safe, reliable infrastructure to travel, to communicate, and to thrive. Now, the fact that an individual may be harmed if exposed to a hazard, that's not a foreign concept with any of us. It's often our infrastructure's most extreme failures, though, like the Minneapolis bridge collapse or that Amtrak train crash outside of Philadelphia, that tend to put infrastructure on Front Street. And recently, though, there's been much written about, again, our country's failing infrastructure systems and about our built environment as a whole. However, we are seeing innovative investments and plans in support of safer, more reliable, environmentally sensitive infrastructure networks. But climate change continues to chase our efforts in all of this. Now, this is a lot, but here today to help us unpack and explore some of this are some really cool people. We have Kate Newman with the World Wildlife Fund, and we have Tony Robinson with Access Building Consultant. Now, Kate is Vice President, Sustainable Infrastructure and Public Sector Initiatives for the World Wildlife Fund, and she specializes in supporting large-scale conservation planning and policy development with a focus on promoting and enabling the global sustainable and nature-based infrastructure. In her 3 decades with World Wildlife Fund, Kate has worked with the WWF around the world to facilitate the integration of cutting-edge conservation science into economic development. Now, before coming to the World Wildlife Fund, Kate worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Zaire, for the U.S. Agency for International Development. Welcome, Kate, and did I get all of that right?
You got it. No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And our other guest is Tony Robinson. Tony is president of Access Building Consultants, design, engineering, and consulting services for resource efficiency and high-performance buildings. We're so glad to have Tony because he is on the ground. He is also an adjunct in environmental sustainability at Southern Methodist University, and he is an author and editor of High Performance Buildings, a guide for owners and managers. As well, Tony has published numerous papers from many of the leading trade and professional building engineering associations and organizations. Welcome, Tony. Did I get all of that right?
You did, Bernice. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad both of you all could be with us today to really try to peel back this and get people to understand why there is a connection between our health and the health of our infrastructure. So, Kate, I want to start with you to talk to us about why is and how is our built infrastructure important for health? In what ways does it impact health?
Infrastructure is the link to healthcare. Let's start with that. If we don't have access to healthcare, which many, many people around the world don't have, they can decline and suffer terribly, depending on the situation and the other kind of safety nets they might have. But around the world, these kinds of infrastructure access issues evade so many people. When it comes to clean water and sanitation, some people just don't have access at all. Here in the States, we've learned a lot about clean water issues in certain towns and understand that infrastructure is vital. You have to get it right. You have to keep it working properly. Then you have access to health care, which is shifting as the world changes. Now we want to drive to health care, but telemedicine is coming online. That could be the game changer of the future. We have risks to ourselves from accidents, from disasters where we have flooding or we have cyclones on the coast. We have wildfires constantly, it seems. And we also have basic safety on the highways where animals, which I'll hope to talk about soon, cross the road and cause 26,000 injuries and 200 deaths a year. So we have the environment conflicting directly with people and causing damage to lives and property. These are examples of how infrastructure generates both a negative impact on human livelihoods and a positive impact in terms of what we need to survive and be happy and comfortable in life.
Indeed. And we're going to go ahead and go to break now. And after the break, though, Kate, we'll be back with you to tell us that important question is, why is infrastructure important to the World Wildlife Fund? And I talk with you all every season. We've got one or two people from this organization on our show, so I know, but I think it's always interesting for our listeners to get the dots connected for them. So we'll be right back on the other side of the break with Kate Newman with the World Wildlife Fund and with Tony Robinson with Access Design Consultants. We want to give a shout-out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, non-mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show on cities, built environments, and infrastructure, how infrastructure affects the health of the environment and our own health. And we are back with Kate Newman with the World Wildlife Fund and Tony Robinson with Access Design Consultants. Again, thank you all so much for being with us. Now, before the break, Kate was about to tell us why the World Wildlife Fund is interested in infrastructure, the built environment, its interface with the environment.
Yeah, that's a great question because it's kind of a new topic for us. So WWF is a global organization, and we focus for the past 60 years on helping the world maintain its wildlife populations. That's what's visible in our institution. But we're also really concerned about the health of the planet and looking at how the planet functions through the ecosystems that provide habitat to wildlife, but also how the climate will be affecting all of this, us and the nature that we depend upon. And there are three major causes of land use change, we call it, or conversion of nature into something else that humans might want. And those are intuitively agriculture, of course, cities, urban development, and the third one is infrastructure. It provides massive change vectors across a landscape. I'm thinking of roads and rail. There's this really cool image from space using remote sensing satellite imagery, and it shows one single road going through the Amazon. And then over 10 years of monitoring this road, feeder roads stem off from the Amazon, and off of those feeder roads are fields, and then off of those feeder roads become towns. And within 10 years, that whole area of the Amazon has been deforested, one single road. So it really matters when you make a decision about things like roads. Another example is Europe is still using the Roman roads that were created thousands of years ago. Infrastructure is largely permanent. It crumbles, but it gets rebuilt. The decision that you make about infrastructure lasts a long time. And then those impacts that it's having on environment will continue to accrue and get worse. So we take a holistic view, not just an animal by animal and what it needs, but what does that habitat need? Where is that habitat in space, on land, in water, in the ocean? And how does that habitat need to survive? What does it need to survive, especially with climate change occurring? And then we then examine what these drivers of change are, like infrastructure, and how we can help make that infrastructure development that people need. How do you make it harmonized with the planet's own health? How do you maintain the natural wealth that we depend upon a lot while giving us the opportunity to thrive ourselves through the built environment and the genius of engineering?
I think, too, that it lays out there before people to try to understand that our environment, the built environment for the most part, is as well inextricably connected or unbreakably connected to the wildlife in nature. Because as you just explained, to the degree that we're building these big projects that support our lifestyles and support our existence on the planet, then we are tearing down and eliminating and decreasing the space for the animals to enjoy and thrive in their lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we do that, then it has a negative or minimizing effect on our lifestyle. Again, that's what we're all about here at Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, is helping people to explore and then see, understand, and internalize that unbreakable relationship between the health of the planet and our own health. And so this is a prime example in this discussion. And again, it's why we talk about cities and the built environment and infrastructure as it relates to environmental health and issues. So, again, thank you for kind of helping us understand that little piece of it, Kate. I want to talk to Tony, though, about how the built infrastructure affects the environment. You know, looking at the large capital infrastructure projects, i.e. typically what people think of as infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, and airports and things like that.
Well, my training and my career, Bernice, has been involved with energy engineering. And it is with buildings. We don't do big infrastructure, but I'm involved with policy making having to do with that. I think what we need to keep in mind is that every time we build infrastructure, we have to extract. We have to do extraction from the ground, from the ocean, from rivers, et cetera. And whenever you do extraction, there are emissions. And the question is, what are you going to do with those emissions? And even after you've built the infrastructure, then you have to maintain it. Maintaining the infrastructure requires more extraction and has more emissions. So there's a whole chain there, production and consumption chain, that we have to analyze both at a micro level and at a macro level to understand ways to make all of that more efficient and less wasteful. Because as Kate has pointed out and you pointed out, I mean, there's more infrastructure being built all the time. And it's unlikely that we're going to just stop building infrastructure. And we already have all this infrastructure in place now that we have to maintain. So we have to be very focused on the energy engineering and resource efficiency of the infrastructure in order to reduce the footprint, reduce the extraction, and reduce the emissions.
Thank you, Tony. And I like how you explain that or lay that out, how it becomes just a self-fulfilling wheel. Mm-hmm. You use up resources and you produce unhealthy things to make it.
I was hoping somebody would mention materials because it comes down to that. And we've been really fascinated by this global sand crisis. Do you know that we have a global sand crisis? Sand is everywhere, but you can't use all of it for construction. Only certain kinds of sand hold that concrete and hold it tight and enable people to build with it. And that sand comes from rivers. Before it gets to the ocean, the ideal sand has passed down a river and it gets to the bottom and it's perfect sand. But once it gets salt on it in the ocean, it's not as great. And worse yet, you can't use any desert sand for construction. It's too
Why is
smooth.
That?
Because the wind has been washing it for 1,000 years and it turns into very smooth little marbles, as they say. And have you ever tried to stack marbles? And that means sand has to be found near where you need to build and nearby because it's heavy and cheap. And so people start grabbing it illegal. There's blood sand extraction going on in India and in the Southeast Asia world to basically help these massive cities grow around the world. California is running out of sand and has a plan to go to Alaska because none of its neighbors will send it any sand. So it's so interesting. These constraints on doing the right thing are leading to the most unexpected scarcities as we continue to expand.
But I'm glad you mentioned that because that is very exemplary, the sand crisis, of things that us ordinary people in our everyday lives are mostly not aware of and wouldn't be, yet until it hits us, and it's certainly in my mind, as you've explained it, has a great propensity to hit us and hit us soon in some unexpected ways, as is happening to us now with many other aspects of our economy that also could be defined as infrastructure. You know, when we look at infrastructure really being defined as a set of structures or facilities that allow something to operate. Mm-hmm. So if that sand crisis is contributing to any of the current home building issues and shortage of houses, which are driving up prices.
I can speak a little bit to that. There are definitely cement and concrete shortages in the building industry now. Not all of that has to do with access. Some of it has to do with commodity pricing. For example, concrete, I've been around the building industry for about 40 years. Concrete is wonderful stuff, but it is very extractive and it's very energy intensive. So for decades, we've been looking at ways to try to minimize the amount of concrete that's used in foundations. And we've been able to innovate, come up with some innovative approaches to that, which reduce the amount of concrete and the amount of steel in foundations. But yeah, as Kate points out about the sand crisis, that's not going to get better because that resource is definitely limited.
And I know, we here in North Texas have had over the last many years have been living with and being made aware of a concrete plant or cement plant, the thing that downwinders at risk was able to get dealt with. Lots of resources and effort going into that.
Yeah, concrete batch plants can have a lot of emissions into the air and into the soil around them. So
yeah, it's one of the most significant emitters of greenhouse gases in the world.
I'm going to need to stop us so we can go to break really quickly, but I want to continue this conversation because where we're going into is real-life examples of the risk and impacts of infrastructure that people need to know about. And we're with Kate Newman with the World Wildlife Fund and with Tony Robinson with Axis Design Consultants. Thank you all. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on cities, built environments, and infrastructure. How infrastructure affects health of the environment as well as our own health. And we are back with Kate Newman with the World Wildlife Fund and Tony Robinson with Axis Building Consultants. Thank you all for being with us again. And we really appreciate you taking time to talk with us and to help us really understand what is out there all around us that most people do not know about. And right before the break, we were talking about some real-life, on-the-ground examples of how infrastructure affects our health. We were talking about the North Texas effort of downwinders at risk, where Tony can explain it better than me, but they are protecting us from the batch plant, and they've been effective in doing that. And so, Kate, do you know of some examples, I know you work on a global, international level, that really point out or show us just how infrastructure can impact health?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll take this case of sand, which is the ingredient in most infrastructure, a little further. There's a case, it's kind of extraordinary. It's a case of river extraction going crazy in Sri Lanka near the capital city. and people having to go down the riverbank so far to find a little bit of water at the left, because once the sand is gone, it's not holding the river water anymore. And it's lowering the whole level of the river and then eroding the banks. And to get water, people have to go with their buckets and are endangered by that. But the odd thing is they've started getting bitten by saltwater crocodiles and killed. Because never before have saltwater crocodiles come up that close to town, but they've scraped away the river so extensively that seawater is now moving way farther up into the interior and pulling with it these dangerous crocodiles. And it's just to have access to sand for construction in cities where there's no regulations and there's no monitoring. But the people are suffering, their lives are suffering, their access to clean water, their access to sanitation from something seemingly unrelated to infrastructure, which is just the extraction of sand. And so you can look at that tiny grain of sand as the beginning of the process and then go all the way up to other examples where in the United States, to use a fantastic scale example, the second largest infrastructure project in our history is in Louisiana, where we are restoring the whole coast of Louisiana to bring back the wetlands to mitigate or to stop the damage from the next big cyclone. $50 billion. The next highest one was the highways, which was $450 billion over 10 years. But after
and which
that,
highways?
That's the whole highway system. They consider that a project.
Okay.
Started in the 50s. It's the world's largest infrastructure project. But this is now
and it's still going.
And it's still going. And this is the recognition after Katrina that by rechanneling rivers and getting rid of the wetlands, we basically had no sponges left to soak up all of that extra water, and it had to flow over those levees, which are too fragile to handle that kind of pressure. And we need to bring nature's infrastructure back in place. And they're spending a huge amount of money to bring back natural infrastructure for the sake of the safety and the livelihoods and the homes of the people that would be damaged if they didn't have those wetlands.
Now, I'm presuming that they don't have those issues yet in Florida.
Oh, well, Florida is, the king tide of Miami is just causing everybody a lot of harm. They're struggling mightily with how are they going to lift the city up, essentially, and keep the water flowing. Nature needs to move, and infrastructure is designed not to move. It's designed to be permanent and impermeable, like the opposite of wildlife, the opposite of water. And we might need to be thinking differently, not so much concrete, more flexibility in what we construct. There's a lot of innovation now on living with infrastructure, even floating bridges. Back in the war days, they existed. Now they're looking at them again. We need to live with how nature needs to function because we're getting battered by nature.
Are we seeing, and I put this question out to both of y'all, what are we seeing as our nation's aging infrastructure is being replanned and replanted, so to speak? What are we seeing? In my mind, there's no reason why we wouldn't be doing all of this reconstruction, redevelopment in an environmentally conscious and sensitive way.
Well, address one thing there. Every year, the American Society of Civil Engineers publishes a report. It's like a grade report for our infrastructure. Last year, our grade was C-. That was the first time in 20 years that it was above D. So that's where we're at on our infrastructure. And ASCE projects that we need $6 trillion worth of not new infrastructure, $6 trillion worth of repairs to the existing infrastructure. And they can't even get this bill for $1.7 trillion out of Congress now, which is not all infrastructure. There's all kinds of other stuff stuck in that bill because everybody has their hat in the ring. And so my question is, this actually kind of refers to what Kate is talking about, is we need to start rethinking the way we interact with infrastructure. And if we do that, we're probably going to be doing a better job of interacting with nature because, as she pointed out, infrastructure is permanent. And until, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, human beings moved. When rivers moved, when the oceans rose, when volcanoes erupted, human beings moved. Our history is actually migrational. So it's only really in the last 400 or 500 years that we've developed societies where we have this massive permanent infrastructure that's not flexible, not adaptable, not movable. And we are going to have to go back to that approach, like it or not. Because when water wants to go somewhere, as I've learned in the construction industry, it's going to go there. You aren't going to stop it.
Indeed. Kate?
Yeah, the COVID pandemic really taught us a lot about the utility of building certain kinds of infrastructure and having it have flexible usages. I heard at the very beginning infrastructure investors using those very words that Tony just used about we have to rethink because now we have airports not being used and they're being used as hospitals. Now we have conference centers that use, for tens of thousands of people being used as hospitals or warehouses for, goods that we need in the emergency. And are we constructing what we need to construct in the way that will accommodate change and shifts over time? Are we constructing things that are going to accommodate climate change, which is making the airport tarmac much hotter and so hot that sometimes airplanes can't land? Are they making bridges wide enough to both accommodate those annual 100-year floods that we're getting, plus allow the wildlife to move so you get a twofer there? Are you thinking, strategically about placement of infrastructure? Infrastructure placement is the most important decision you can make. That will affect everything. If you can go around, you might be able to add benefits to communities you go near and maintain that wild space to avoid spillover from zoonotic diseases or other harm while allowing wildlife to be sustained. Just go around or build a fancy bridge over it, like just got launched in California last week, a beautiful new, largest in America, what do you call it? This ecoduct is what they call it in some countries, but it's a wildlife land bridge to allow animals to keep moving in the direction they're going to move no matter what. And if you allow animals to move, then they'll be able to maintain their populations, they'll access food and mates, they'll be able to thrive while living.
How did they make that happen in California? That is so cool.
It is L.A.
Yeah.
I'm super impressed. It was a private philanthropy partnership with Metro LA, and it's taken a long time, but they succeeded. And I can say to the listeners, there's some great videos to understand this concept of animals will try to get to the other side, of coyote and a badger meeting at one of these underpasses, and then the coyote saying, "Come on, let's go," and the badger, and then they go together, and it's the cutest thing ever. But it's a great image of the value of just giving animals some space.
And we'll finish that on the other side of the break. We're going to go to Shout Out now. We will be back with Kate Newman from the World Wildlife Fund and with Tony Robinson with Axis Design Consultants. Thank you. We'll be right back. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority, for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lund Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach. None Mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lyndentalcare.com. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today, to our show on cities, built environments, and infrastructure. How infrastructure affects the health of the environment as well as our own health. And we are back with Kate Newman with the World Wildlife Fund, who's explaining to us why the World Wildlife Fund has a whole unit developed to sustainable infrastructure. And our other guest is Tony Robinson with Access Building Consultants. Again, thank you all so much for taking time to be with us today. Now, before the break, Kate was talking to us about the most important decision to be made about infrastructure is placement. And I think that's probably the place where most people hear about it or think about it or come into contact with the whole idea of infrastructure. These days, if they get something that an airport is going to be situated near them or is going to be expanded or things like that. And I put this out to both of you all, how conscious and sensitive is our society today to green infrastructure? And I guess I'll start with Tony so you can explain to us what is green infrastructure, because so many terms today are taken and meanings added on to them that they become not recognizable. So tell us what green infrastructure is.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, Bernice, the word green, at least from the standpoint of those of us who are energy engineers or in construction, has just too broad a meaning. And so it's really hard to pin down, what that means. If you spend more time defining what sustainability is and what resource efficiency is, you can get much closer to what that means. But in general, what we want to do in the building industry is we're looking for waste reduction and material reduction. That is our primary focus in terms of increasing the environmental sustainability of infrastructure. Obviously, the placement of it is absolutely critical as well. If we can figure out how to have less of it, do less of it, because the way we're doing it is not efficient and it is wasteful, then it's going to make the footprint of whatever infrastructure we need that much smaller.
Indeed. Now, Tony, research has showed that the U.S. is wasting, as you mentioned, and they mentioned that waste is anywhere from 30 to 65% of our energy, our food, our water, and our materials every year. So what's the relationship of that or nexus of that finding or that issue with our built environment?
We're all consumers, and about 70% of GNP in the United States is devoted to personal consumption expenditures. So we're at the end of the supply and production chain. So there's really a huge opportunity for citizens or consumers to change their behavior and become more focused on conservation and waste reduction, which previous generations in the United States did all the time. I would like to point out, for example, my grandparents and my parents, and for some reason we've gotten away from that. It's something that we know how to do. It's not a new thing. So I think if we could be very focused on, it could be as simple as you make sure your porch light is not on during the day. We did some calculations in energy engineering on things like this, and using a paper cup twice, it adds up really fast if you get millions of people to do it, because it has a mass effect. We calculated you could save billions of kilowatt hours every year just by using a paper cup twice. Same thing with turning off the porch light. It seems like a small thing. It's part of our infrastructure, but it's amazing how many of these things people are unaware of and aren't doing anything about it.
That waste. You know what it makes what I wonder, and I don't know, I put this to either of y'all. Are there any, dollar estimates of waste cost in some of these areas. I think that would make a real impact also for us to hear that.
The waste is in the trillions of dollars every year. I mean, it's a staggering amount of waste, and we're just not aware of it because we're not analyzing it all through the entire production consumption chain. So
Indeed.
That's part of what we're working on in our research on this.
Now, Kate, how do you all look at or define the term green infrastructure?
Yeah, we actually recently created a whole document of different definitions for sustainability, including green, natural, ecological, nature-based infrastructure. Green has been really taken on by the climate and energy sector. So when you hear green building, it's low carbon kind of building techniques. So we've veered a little bit away from that to call things that we are looking at in the natural environment natural infrastructure, or nature-based infrastructure, or ecological infrastructure, depending on what part of the world you're in, to be clearer that we're talking about the whole system, not just the relationship to climate change. So
I like that. I think those are good terms, because what we're finding is, and research is finding, a lot of times the terms we use will cause people to kind of tune out because they don't understand it, they don't realize it, and they most often hear that term in relationship to something they think is different than what we're talking about. And sustainability many times is that. I know I tend to use it. People ask me, why do you use all three words? I said, so people get it. I use green, healthy, and sustainable.
Yeah.
If I use all three words, they got it. Because they got some other things they can associate with. But I like that nature-based solution.
Which is also part of the climate discussion. It's looking at how we can look at nature in terms of capturing carbon, like forests, holding it. Nature is also helping us mitigate the impacts or lessen the impacts of climate change, building our resilience. You'll see a lot of that word these days. All part of the global climate discussion. That's included in nature-based. So sometimes nature-based means using an idea from nature, an image from nature, like something you might have seen in some cities called bioswales, which is just a swale in the ground to channel some water into a rain garden. So that's mimicking nature's way of channeling flows of water into water bodies that is now in your garden as a rain garden. But that's green infrastructure in terms of taking ideas from nature, using your own sweat and blood and making it happen in your garden. Natural infrastructure is a little bit different. It means stepping back and seeing what nature's delivering to us naturally and for free as an infrastructure service. And the best example of that we usually use is mangroves. If you have a lot of mangroves dense enough along your coastline, accompanied ideally by some coral reefs and some seagrass, when you get that big hurricane, you're going to have much less damage to the communities living behind that barrier than if you had nothing. A seawall is what people are used to, but seawalls are usually sufficient, like in an urban area, but they erode over time, they degrade. One of our other things that needs to be maintained, and they also become inefficient when there's sea level rise and they weren't built tall enough. Yet a mangrove can accommodate all of that shifting and be that flexible barrier that you're going to really need.
The barrier for the waves. Now, let me ask you this, Kate, though. What about people who are in more urban areas, like us here in North Texas or other areas? How would we tell us about some of the natural infrastructure that we might encounter daily or periodically?
What you might be seeing, and I'm not following Houston closely, but I know they're thinking a lot about this after their floods, is what was supposed to soak up the water when it rained for 6 days? What was missing, and where did all that water go? It went down the sidewalks into the driveways, and it turns out that area has lower areas that could have been absorbing the water that had been developed. This is common everywhere. So what you're seeing nowadays is actually people removing old infrastructure, decommissioning the channelization of rivers with concrete that you see, like in LA, famous,
everywhere.
Removing that, putting in rocks, putting in trees, bringing in that sand I was describing. If the sand can sit still, it will hold water, and then the trees will grow better alongside. That channelization just drives the water straight out. And so there's new ways of really thinking about cities and what they actually have that can help them.
And we're getting near the end of our time. I had wanted to ask you, whoever thought of that idea of paving those drainage things anyway. But anyway, we just don't have time. and that's always our challenge. We have 2 minutes to go, 1 minute to go. And so I want to segue to Tony and then back to Kate really briefly in terms of last words, and that is, what can ordinary people in their everyday lives do to help drive solutions? Tony.
Well, I wanted to respond to Kate a little bit there on that example with the mangroves. We have a tendency with infrastructure to regard everything as a barrier, something that's hardscape or something like that. But the natural world, as she was explaining, is more like a membrane or a filter. And we need to take that approach more with infrastructure. We are doing it with buildings. The building envelope has been regarded as a barrier to everything. But actually, the building envelope can be more like a membrane or a collector. And so that, that engages a shift in the way we think about the character of infrastructure.
I love that. Thank you all so much. Yeah, we're at the end of our time now, and we have just been really engaged with Kate Newman from the World Wildlife Fund and Tony Robinson with Access Design Consultants. Thank you all so much. You've made us smarter and certainly given us a lot to think about. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout lines, so that we can all realize that we have to work together in order to have that healthy life on a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourself. And each of them, though tiny, can seem insignificant. But all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening in today, and join us again next week as we continue our conversations on cities, built environments, and infrastructure. Thank you.